The Wisconsin Council of Churches welcomes you to this four-part study on going deeper with Scripture, the Church, and racism. While the gospel seems clear on the evil of racism, the Church has not always lived up to the gospel's call. Dr. Denney Weaver and Pastor Nick Utval, members of the Council's Peace and Justice Commission, lead us through four brief presentations which offer historical, biblical, and theological discussions of the Church and racism. The first presentation gives an historical overview of the Church's record. The second shows how Jesus confronted the racism of his times. In the third, the presenter explains how theology has sometimes allowed racism to arise and develop. The final presentation offers a theological defense of nonviolent activism as the appropriate Christian response to racism. Each presentation is followed by discussion questions, which you can find on our website at wichurches.org on the Racial Equity Study Guide page under the Resources tab. Thank you for joining us.
Unheard Voices in Nonviolent Struggle. Previous lesson dealt with the accommodation of racism in some theological applications. Not surprisingly, there have been protests of all manner against racist practices. And we are once again in a time when these protests are much in our news. In this lesson, I will offer my perspective on why an activist nonviolent protest or active nonviolent resistance is both in line with the story of Jesus that we discussed in Lesson 2 and also a very practical way to proceed. In an interview with Mike Wallace in 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "A riot is the language of the unheard." That comment resurfaced in recent months following riots by African Americans in Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, Maryland, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Deaths of young African American men at the hands of police officers precipitated the riots. King's comment raises important questions. If King is correct, and I think he is, why do African Americans feel unheard? And what message is behind the anger expressed through riots? For Christians, in light of what we saw about accommodating of racism in the previous lesson, there are questions that we need to answer about our responses to two kinds of violence, that of the police officers and that of the riots. Riot is a blanket term that's been used to cover a range of activities, sometimes even including civil disobedience. In this presentation, I use riot to refer to destructive acts such as looting, burning of cars, beating of people. But as we will see, I support other kinds of vigorous protest. Two recent books suggest reasons for anger at the system of policing. In The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander provides a detailed analysis of how the so-called war on drugs is directed primarily against people of color, although statistics show that the percent of people in white communities involved in illegal drug use is the same as in black communities. The result of the war on drugs is mass incarceration of African Americans, and with a felony on their records, they have difficulty the rest of their lives in finding jobs and housing. This so-called war has thus created a permanent underclass. Alexander calls the process metaphorically the new Jim Crow. The book Pulled Over by Charles R. Epp, Stephen Maynard Moody, and Donald Hayter Markle describes investigatory stops that alienate African Americans. Investigatory stops are those in which the officer uses an excuse, such as a failure to signal a lane change, as a reason to stop a driver. However, the real purpose of the stop is to search the car for drugs or weapon. Across the country, in a pattern well documented by Epp, Maynard Moody, and Hayter Markle, officers are trained to stop primarily people of color, the vast majority of whom are innocent. These stops of innocent people for trivial reasons create suspicion of police among African Americans, while white people who are not subject to such stops more often trust the police. Much more could be said, but I believe that these two books describe conditions that contribute to the anger that is expressed in riots. Theology may contribute indirectly. When we consider theology in its context, we are able to see how Christian beliefs contribute to the hopelessness of rioting. Recall what we saw in the previous lesson. By emphasizing the belief that the important confession about Jesus is his deity, issues of race and violence may be seen as political issues unrelated to Christian faith. Thus, some Christians have long felt comfortable in ignoring the race-related conditions that contribute to the anger expressed in riots. I understand the anger that produces riots, but I do not believe that that option embodies the transformative way of Jesus. Observation of history shows that violence is cyclical. It is always possible to take one step farther back in history to find the factor that precipitated a given eruption of violence. An act of violence that is supposed to teach a lesson and enact justice actually sets the stage for retaliation and a new round of violence. Riots produce more police presence. Eventually the riot loses energy and calm or peace is said to be restored. But it is a false calm, a false presence. The underlying problem remains, and the anger of the unheard begins to build again, smoldering until the next spark sets off an explosion. I suggest that a better expression of anger by the unheard is nonviolent struggle. Nonviolent struggle can expose the injustice of the system and make clear the need for change. Rather than being an expression from a position of privilege, nonviolence shaped by a commitment to radical justice is revolutionary and resilient. It makes visible the need for change and sets in motion real forces of change, because it is not merely bent on expressing anger and waging destruction. Nonviolent struggle can be maintained for a long period of time. Anger, turned into righteous indignation, can become a powerful motivation for the good, sustaining a protest until real change occurs. Nonviolent struggle exposes injustice and speaks for systemic change. And alongside this nonviolent struggle, white people, or those who benefit from positions of privilege, most certainly should be willing to acknowledge their complicity with the system and be willing to challenge its injustice and join in nonviolent struggle themselves. Jesus certainly taught nonviolent struggle and engaged in it himself. As Walter Wink explains in Jesus and Nonviolence, a Third Way, when Jesus says, "Resist not evil," in the language of the King James Version, it actually means do not resist evil with similar evil, or do not mirror evil. Jesus gave 3 examples of this kind of resistance. Turning the other cheek was a way for a supposed social inferior to resist humiliation when slapped by a superior. Giving the outer garment along with the undergarment and walking around naked exposed an unjust debtor's system. Giving the outer garment along with the undergarment and walking around naked exposed an unjust debtor's court system in a society where shame fell on the one who caused the nakedness. Going the second mile would put a Roman soldier in violation of his own regulations, which allowed him to order a civilian to carry his 60 or 80-pound pack for 1 mile. Going the second mile put the civilian in charge, as the soldier begged him to put down the pack before the commanding officer discovered the violation of regulation. Jesus certainly taught nonviolent struggle and engaged in it himself. As Walter Wink explains in Jesus and Nonviolence, a Third Way, when Jesus says, "Resist not evil," in the language of the King James Version, it actually means do not resist evil with similar evil, or do not mirror evil. Jesus gave 3 examples of this kind of resistance. Turning the other cheek was a way for a supposed social inferior to resist humiliation when slapped by a superior. Giving the outer garment along with the inner undergarment and walking around naked exposed an unjust debtor's court system in a society where shame fell on the one who caused the nakedness. Going the second mile would put a Roman soldier in violation of his own regulation, which allowed him to order a civilian to carry his 60 to 80 pound pack for 1 mile. Going the second mile put the civilian in charge, as the soldier begged him to put the pack down before the commanding officer discovered the violation of regulations. Consider Jesus' healing of the withered hand on the Sabbath in Luke 6. He could have waited until the next day. However, Jesus called the man to come and stand by him, and then waited till all eyes were on him before telling the man to stretch out his hand. This healing was a deliberately confrontational and highly visible action that exposed the misuse of the Sabbath. It has been suggested that the story of Jesus in what is called the cleansing of the temple was a violent act. The Gospel of John even adds that Jesus made a whip from cords. That fact may be hard to bear for people whose story includes a long history of brutal beatings. A whip in Jesus' hands does not sound like a nonviolent action. But I propose that we look at this action in the total scope of Jesus' life. At the beginning of his ministry in the synagogue at Nazareth, he announced that his ministry was to bring good news to the poor, release of captives, sight to the blind, freedom for the oppressed. He taught love of enemies, responding to evil without mirroring it, and gave the 3 examples of nonviolent resistance. His story contains many acts of healing, which often contain statements of forgiveness. He forgave the woman taken in adultery. He broke Sabbath laws by healing on the Sabbath. His teaching and travel in Samaria confronted racism. We could give many more such stories. At his trial, Jesus told Pilate, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." In other words, Jesus' kingdom had different standards than Pilate's kingdom. Finally, there is the fact that Jesus did not use the action in the temple to initiate a violent rebellion, nor did the crucifixion of Jesus stimulate his followers to start a violent rebellion. I cannot see the Jesus of this entire story using the whip to injure people in the way that whips caused so much pain in African American history, both past and present. When I read that story, I see Jesus using the whip to herd animals. When considered in the full arc of Jesus' life, I think that his action in the temple is one more confrontation to put alongside Sabbath healings and more. I put it in the category of vigorous nonviolent protest or activism, an act of righteous indignation or even righteous anger. As he said, "My house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." There's actually a long history of nonviolent struggle. Among contemporary models is Martin Luther King Jr., the most prominent leader of the American civil rights movement. Since God is revealed in Jesus, Jesus' life, that is, his teaching and example of nonviolent struggle, reflect the character, the very grain of the universe that God created. I believe that nonviolent struggle reflects the grain of the universe. Martin Luther King Jr. drew collaborators from many sides. We come to the struggle for racial justice from various social locations, but from our various sides, white people and people of color can join together to expose injustice and to support nonviolent struggle wherever we see such action that reflects the grain of the universe revealed in the story of Jesus. If you would like discussion questions for these remarks, please go to the Wisconsin Council of Churches website and click on the link that gives you the printed version of these remarks.